So good morning and welcome everybody here to Bath. I hope you had a safe and comfortable trip here to Bath. My name is Michael Stimmelmeier and I joined Bath in 2019. And this is also the time when I first got in contact with core and the economy. So while preparing for my introductory microeconomics class, I went to Warwick to the core workshop there, and it was great meeting already some of you at this workshop. Of course, now it's great to be back in person in the post-pandemic area and having this workshop here. So thank you very much to Wendy and Sam for giving us the opportunity here in Bath to host the workshop. And of course, thank you to Luca and Giacomo for their support in organizing the workshop. And also a great thank you to the local organizers here. So Matteo did a lot of work, the technicians who enable our hybrid meeting, and of course, Neve, who did a lot of the local organization. So I assume you had the chance to go around in Bath and visit the city also a bit. So Bath is very famous for the Roman bath. Then it's one of the rare sites with a double heritage. But there's also some other particular feature of Bath, which links the city of Bath to core. And I'm sure not every one of you might be aware of this linkage. And however, those of you who are teaching core and use the economy, they might be familiar with the chapter 2 on technology, population, and growth. And a big chunk of this chapter is on Malthusian economics. And this famous Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus, who died in 1834, has his last rest here in the Abbey of Bath. And I think this is a nice connection between core and the city of Bath. And therefore, we are very happy to have the workshop here. All right, today or tonight, when we go for dinner, you also might have the possibility to see the Abbey, and then you know, okay, this is where Malthus has his final rest. I wish all of you a productive workshop and have a good time here in Bath. Thank you very much for joining us. And now I will hand over to Wendy.
Thank you very much, Michael. We've already learned something today. That's amazing. Okay, so welcome to everyone. It's fantastic to see so many people here. And as Michael said, there's a wonderful mixture of the old and the new and the young. I think we're hoping for the usual core workshop, which is full of enthusiasm, criticism, and hopefully the basis for doing some things better. So that's what we're always hoping to come out of the workshop. So everyone's got a copy of the program. There's no need to talk through the program. The big focus in some sense is the work that we've been doing over the last few years to create the 2.0 version of the economy. And we're just going to present some features of that during the workshop. And the first volume of that will be available in May. So people who will be teaching in the autumn, the micro side of things, you'll have a new 2.0 volume 1 to work with. And there'll be exciting updates about the timing of the macro at a later date. So I think without spending more time, I think we should go straight into the first session and hand over to Sam, who's going to kick off our presentation.
Hi, is the sound working?
The sound's extremely good, Sam.
Great, and the video showing on the screen?
No, we're seeing you at the moment. So if you could switch it to the other view, then we'll see the screen. So you've got we haven't got the screen share at the moment. Yep, looking good. Yes, absolutely perfect. So
okay.
Why don't you take it away?
Well, hi, everybody. I deeply regret that I'm not there with you. I had planned to be there, but COVID intervened. I am sad to say I'm well now, but I am sorry I couldn't come there. You can see something right off from the slide in front of you, which is that we will have 2 volumes in TE 2.0. And in a way, this is a big concession because we swore that we would never treat economics as divisible into micro and macro. But particularly in the US, there's a lot of pressure to have a separate book for each one. And so if you can see there, we have surrendered to the market, at least the US market, in this small way, but we haven't surrendered in many other ways, I don't think. This is the outline of now we admit to calling it the microeconomic part of the economy. It's very much like the first part of the old TE 1.0. I'll talk about just a couple of things. I want to talk about the first 2 chapters, not about Malthus, but about some other aspects of it. May say a word or 2 about the bargaining game, how institutions distribute income. In the next session, Margaret will be talking about a really quite new unit on owners, managers, and employees, the labor market, and so on. But let's go to the first couple of units of the book. You remember we start, and we do again, with the capitalist revolution, our famous hockey sticks. We focused attention on the kink in the hockey stick, and it was, we thought, very effective, but we had a view that there is something a little all too good about this kink in the hockey stick. Students came away from it thinking, oh, wow, that's pretty terrific. The UK took off, and then some other countries got lucky and they took off too. We called this thing the British Industrial Revolution as if it was something that happened in Great Britain. We were even accused by some of our own team of adopting a Whig interpretation of history, which is that nothing could happen for a long time, and finally the present or happened, and that's pretty good. Now, thinking over the first 2 units, they are very effective. They engage students, they get people focusing attention on a really big historical problem, not some toy problem, not shopping, but something really important. They focus people on a set of institutions, namely capitalism. So as far as that's concerned, definitely 2 cheers for Unit 1. It did what it was supposed to do. It's a very unusual way to begin a course in microeconomics, but we think a very effective one in asking a big question in a good way. But the basic idea was that the students come away with this is that, oh, there's this thing called capitalism and it causes this hockey stick, and that's basically a good thing. Okay, there's some talk in the chapter about, well, there's some maybe climate problems, but the big message is, wow, people became affluent because of capitalism. Actually, at the time we were writing units 1 and 2, Wendy and I and some others, we had our doubts about the story. It was kind of too good. It did seem a little Pollyanna-ish. So after we'd finished 1.0, we had an ongoing discussion with a number of people about how we might take better account of the kind of unpleasant side of the hockey stick, the downside. And just to let you know where we're going, instead of capitalism gives you the hockey stick, we now have a story which is capitalism plus carbon plus colonies. We like alliteration, obviously, give you the hockey stick. And that's, I mean, in a line, that's the new storyline of units 1 and 2. I'll tell you a bit about what we did. From TE 1.0, you can see that we had some second thoughts about too much of a good thing. We pointed out at the end of colonial rule, India was a desperately poor country having been about as wealthy or about the same average income as Britain 3 or 4 centuries earlier. The same was true of China. So looking at the data, we already had some hint that there was a global phenomenon taking place, not a British industrial revolution, but a reorganization of the entire world economy. So we wanted to reframe the problem from something that happened in England because of, the right institutions and a bunch of creative people and the Enlightenment and inventiveness and so on, to essentially a restructuring of the entire global economy. This is a figure, I actually took this slide from Our World in Data, where you can have many of the core data sets. This is actually the data which is in 1.0. And the 2 countries there you see are China and India. And it's quite remarkable. If you present them in a ratio scale, it's very clear that there is a rather significant decline in the per capita income in both countries from the period around 1600 to the middle of the last century. And this is, of course, associated with, in the case of India, with India being a colony. In the case of China, with China becoming dominated, at least coastal China, by European nations. And so we've now added to Unit 1 a section, did British colonialism in India reduce living standards in India? And we provide a positive answer to that. We also worked in the interim on, as you can see, a South Asian version of the economy, along with Arjun Jayadev and a group at Azam Premji University. And while working with them, we decided to chart the course of global output over the period of time there since 1500. And we liked this graph so much that we added another image. So this is the Pliers graph, and it should keep in your mind that this is a quite dramatic reorganization of world output that took place as Europe expanded militarily and also demographically into many parts of the world. The answer to the question, did British colonialism in India reduce living standards? We ended with a quite strong positive answer to that, talking about the design of railways for military use rather than economic development, the entrenching of local elites. A little personal footnote, I actually wrote a paper on this when I was a grad student. I had a very good economic historian as my advisor, it's a wonderful thing when you can dust off some notes that you had from when you were a grad student and say, oh, that's a pretty good idea. It's kind of, we regret we didn't do more on this in 1.0, but we're quite happy with the way we've dealt with it here. We also added a section on the capitalist revolution as a structural transformation of an economy, transforming an economy from a farming economy under non-capitalist production to a capitalist organized industrial or manufacturing economy. We included, these are from the South Asian Perspective book. These are a chart of structural change. This is non-agricultural share of labor, seeing this as a very dramatic part of the process of capitalist development. And this allowed us to introduce what is my favorite growth model, that is the Arthur Lewis dual economy model. And we also developed that model later, and we'll use it in the macro book. Wendy will have a word to say about that. And we actually apply that to the global economy and to the gig economy. In Unit 2, we have a new section called Markets, Cheap Calories, and Cotton, the colony slavery and the Industrial Revolution in Britain. this is kind of parallel to the section about India. We ask here, what was the relationship between the colonization of the Caribbean and also North America and the Industrial Revolution? And we add there we greatly expand our treatment of the role that calories, primarily from sugar from the Caribbean, played in providing nutrition for the growing working class. And a very well developed argument, which we find convincing, which is without the access to those calories primarily from sugar, there would have been the usual choking off of the accumulation process, a bidding up of wages and so on. It was this unlimited supply of calories produced by enslaved labor that permitted the expansion to continue, which accounts for the Industrial Revolution that taken place in the UK. We also include a treatment of the effect of the slave trade on Africa, drawing on the work of Nathan Nunn, and along with Leonard Wanchicon, who you see there. This is a hard question. We think actually it's a kind of a nuanced answer. If you think about the Industrial Revolution in the US, probably was less dependent on slavery than the UK, but we think it was an essential part of it, and the students should come away from this now with a more balanced picture that essentially this is not something happening in England. It happened throughout the world through both a process of innovation, which we stress in Unit 2, but also through the development of coerced labor and colonial rule. We end up with a rather simple aphorism now. I slightly expanded it, adding something else, beginning with C: capitalism, carbon colonies, and calories produced by enslaved Caribbean labor. We've asked some students from Bath, Salvador, Lara, and Ting, to comment on our new 2.0. And let's hear from them now. I will now stop sharing my screen, and hopefully I can hear the comments that they have to offer. I'd like to thank them in advance for reading our 2 units and developing some ideas about them.
Great. And Matteo is going to introduce them to you.
Okay. So let me go next to the mic so that they can hear me. Hi, so we've asked 3 of our students who have studied on the core econ book this year in semester 1 and semester 2 as well, some of them, to comment on the first drafts that Sam and Wendy have shared with us, to tell us what they think and to let us know whether they can see any room for improvement, or whether they find it more clear or less clear. So we have here Lara, who is from the BSc International Development with Economics, and she's from Seychelles. Then we have Salvador, BSc Economics, a student of Michael, from Mexico, right? And then we've got Ting, Accounting and Finance from China, who have kindly written some comments, and they are going to share them with us. Okay, so Lara, if you want to go first.
Hi. I guess I should start with like the positives. I found that there was a greater level of background explanations on the different concepts, which made it easier for me to understand its origins and its workings. A good example is the Malthusian theory. I feel like in these new units, I feel like there was more concentration on them. I don't know about my friends, but I think I found it a little bit confusing when learning about it the first time. So yeah, the greater depth into it really helped. The inclusion of colonialism offers, I think, a good explanation as to why the global South are poorer and I feel like behind in development than the rest of the world. I feel like it removes a little bit of blame on like these countries themselves and their systems, and puts a little bit of responsibility on European countries and their influence. And I feel like there's more graphs. I think he like put one up with the pliers. I do enjoy like having more diagrams and graphs as I prefer to be visually engaged than having to read like large chunks of paragraphs. And yeah, overall, I feel like the inclusion of colonialism and slavery, like it was good, and it, you know, put responsibility on the West, and then I feel like the usual explanation of just capitalism and deregulation are the way to go. Possible notes that I have is like in the first unit, I feel like they described like India. I remember like in the first pages, we're talking about India and how in like the 1400s, it was a prosperous country. There was food in abundance. And I think just below it, like it introduced the idea that at the time, Italy would have had higher standards of living than India. And there was like no explanation as to why like that would be the case. So I feel like it was also mentioned that Europe was reeling under the effects of the bubonic plague. So I found that a little bit confusing as to why you would consider this country better, even though you've just explained that India was doing pretty good. In Unit 1, I feel like there were some additions on slavery that seemed a little bit random, and they didn't add much to what was being discussed in the unit. I don't think it makes sense to have them unless you are talking about the direct impact that slavery had, like you do in Unit 2. I feel like Unit 2 definitely incorporates the impact that slavery has better. In Unit 1, it just felt like it was like additions that didn't feel really like it connected well. I have like a few examples, like it's just 2 examples, but there was one line from Unit 1, page 54. Like the point on the explanation of the slave economy makes sense, but it still feels like it was randomly brought up and doesn't add much to what is being discussed. It feels nothing more than an example. And then on page 51 from the same unit, it says, in other economic systems, some human beings, enslaved people, were private property. Again, like this point makes sense, but instead of it feeling like a random interjection, I feel like it would make more sense to integrate it in your paragraphs. And then lastly, my point is on the genocide of the native tribes for colonial gain in the Americas. I feel like having them in the side note is a bit reductive. Also, the military defeat, I feel like it lightens the extent of which the colonies went to obtain the land. You know, it involved like massacres, starvation, and assimilation, and like cultural extinction. So I feel like a little bit of highlights of what those peoples went through would also be important. That's it.
That's great.
Good morning. Good morning. As previously mentioned, yeah, this new version of Core Econ has the same benefits as the previous one. It does explain the main theories behind macroeconomics in a more digestible way for students, especially stuff that we don't necessarily have to learn in high school level, especially Malthusianism and all the factors that go behind the hockey stick growth, which is a good way of like picturing why and how this happened. But there are like still and it's good to include the impact of like the the colonies and slavery that had in this growth of capitalism. But I do have some comments on the phrasing of it and how some readers of the book might come off with a different interpretation of what the author and like what us in the workshop will want to like have them have. So in section 1.8 capital institutions, as previously mentioned, when we introduced the concept of private property, I feel like it's not the best place to mention that in other economic systems, some human beings, enslaved people, were private property. I would suggest removing this, as mentioning slavery when introducing the concept of private property will come off to some readers as maybe either insensitive or downplaying it. And I wouldn't say it's the best place to mention slavery as an example of like private property. Same with like the part later where like it's mentioned like the slave economy, where it's like an economic system where most of the workers are by people who are not hired by wages, but instead like the land on which they work are private property for another person. I would suggest maybe in that explanation also adding the exploitative aspect to a system like slavery. In section 1.10, capitalism, causation, and history's hockey stick, just as you mentioned previously in the slides, there is a big emphasis on if British colonization of India reduced Indian living standards, and it is a really interesting read and a really good way of like introducing a natural experiment. But I would suggest maybe rephrasing it the way that this section is called. The section right now is called "Did British colonization of India reduce Indian living standards?" I would suggest changing this, as asking this question should suggest that there is merit to the argument that British colonization did not reduce Indian living standards. And this to readers can be misinterpreted as the book giving validity to colonialist or imperialist apologetics. As an example, if you were to ask this to most Indian students, they would just flat out say yes, instead of like just like actually just hearing you out. I would change it to something more neutral, such as like the impact of British colonization on Indian living standards, as it still gives room to explain the natural experiment, but it doesn't suggest that there's a silver lining to British colonization. And then in Unit 2, in section 2.9, markets, cheap, calories, and cotton, just as like you mentioned previously, it's good that this content is mentioned, but the way that it is mentioned, I think it should be rephrased, especially when like talking about the colonies and slave labor being necessary. I feel like the word necessary would need to be removed, or not removed, or maybe like changed to something else, as this could very easily be misinterpreted as the book justifying slavery and colonization as a necessity. It would be better to rephrase it as neutrally as possible, as not to like undermine the points being made, as it is true that they did play a key role in the Industrial Revolution. But then again, mentioning a necessity instead of just outlining the impact would make the book have a different interpretation, maybe have a different interpretation to readers, which is not the best thing that could happen. And yeah, that's some comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Salvador.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So first, I want to say I really like and enjoy reading this book, and it's still really helpful to me to my economic study. And for the first reason, I feel like the language is really understandable, and there's no very professional terminology or very complex grammar or sentences. So which is very hard to read. It was all very very easy for me to understand as a non-English native speaker. So this is still really helpful to me, and I really like it. And so next, I will make a little suggestion. I would suggest to have some more comparative table or like mind map or flow chart. So basically make more text explanation into more visible. Like for example, we can make a comparison table after explaining the long-run Malthusian model and short-run Malthusian model, so that we can like directly and quickly identify what are the differences between them, and like where we need to pay more attention, so that we can understand more clearly, and also it was very helpful for us to memorizing. And also the mind map or other flow chart is will be also very helpful. It can help us to like quickly and clearly understand what the whole process of the changing of the revolution and how it impacts step by step to the other economic factors. And next, I really like the example that mentioned in the book, and I found that there's even more real life example in the new version, like such as the relationship between colonization and the living standard in India, and why Africa is so poor is kind of very interesting, and I think many people will engage and really interested in it. The new edition is much more comprehensive and informative, and provide lots of data in terms of explanation, and uses so many examples. And I think like I prefer to bring the theory and economic principle into more real life example into the application and case study, instead of just explain the most classical model of economics or the economic theory. So we would like to understand it, not just understand it, but also know how to apply it and how to analysis when we met some new case study or find some new like social phenomenon or news in the future. And so I think it will be really helpful. Yeah, that's everything I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Just would like to thank once more our students.
Thank you, Matteo, and thank you very much for coming, Salvador, Lara, and Tia. So there are many things that we took away from that. I could see Margaret was hammering away on the keyboard. And as we've, we're literally in the last throes of signing off these units. But I thought two very interesting insights emerged from, a whole lot of detail, but the things that really struck me were that nuance in language is obviously extremely important, and having your ears tuning to the language that we had thought had been very carefully chosen was it's invaluable. So I think it's thank you very much, and it will certainly be taken to heart. Such small things as turning a question into a statement is very striking, and it's not something that we'd thought clearly about. So that was the first. And the second thing I found very striking in what you said was an emphasis on visualization. And I'm quite interested to know, and there must be learning about this from the learning sciences, about how people learn, and maybe how people learn is indeed changing, and that we may be able to do more in terms of using visual representations, or at least creating or encouraging opportunities for instructors to help students to create mind maps and the like, in understanding causal processes. So economics is, if it does one thing, it helps us to think clearly about causal processes, and in principle they are very helpfully represented in flow charts and kind of mind maps of the sort that you were sketching in relation to Malthus. So I think those contributions and the more detailed ones you made are extremely well taken. I just wanted to know whether Sam wanted to respond as well.
Yes, thank you, Wendy. First, Laura and Salvador and Ting, thanks so much for the comments. I learned a lot from them, and it's interesting. Some of the things that you raised are things that we worried about too, but I think we didn't worry enough. A problem that comes up over and over again is that the process of explaining the mechanism or the process by which something happened, explaining how it happened, often seems to justify it. And And that, for example, Salvador, you said that calling it necessary, slavery was necessary for the Industrial Revolution, for example, could be read to mean, oh, well, okay, it's not so nice, but we had to have it. And indeed, I think there are probably people who think that way. So we have to clearly differentiate explanation from justification, and I don't think we did that. And also, calling the experience of Native Americans a military defeat. Larry, you're absolutely right. Yes, it was a military defeat, but in fact, it sounds like, oh, they had a war and they lost. Well, too bad. That isn't what happened. And that isn't, it doesn't convey in any sense either the history of it or the brutality of it and the fact that we should have an emotional reaction to that of some kind. And Ting, one of the things I really loved about what you said is you said, not only learn the models, but learn how to apply them to a new problem. Absolutely. That's what, when we constantly use the word not learning economics, but doing economics. And what you said, it just made me so happy. It's that absolutely, that's what we're trying to do. Thanks a whole lot. We have more work to do. We love changing what we write, and we love the criticism that you've offered us. Thanks so much.
Thanks again. Okay, so I think it's back over to this side. Are you going to put up slides from here? Great. Okay, fantastic. Okay, great. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we've done with the macroeconomics volume, which is in process. So there's plenty of opportunities for people to contribute. I'm going to talk a little bit about the starting point. But just to highlight that where we begin the second volume is what used to be Unit 9 in the economy. So we're starting with the whole economy model, with the determination of unemployment, real wages, and inequality. So this is the WSPS model that will be the beginning of the second volume. We're then going to talk about aggregate demand and the multiplier, and then inflation, unemployment, and the Phillips curve. So you can see this is a kind of mashup of the existing units. And the idea is that we set up a working model that students have to understand. Do I have to speak a little quick? Okay. The students will have a working model of the macroeconomy after they've done these 4 units with a fairly simple understanding of monetary policy, just using the interest rate. So, for example, we will not have introduced balance sheets up until this point. So that allows us to give a more kind of straight line, if you like, to a model of medium run equilibrium, a model of the determination of output and employment, and the derivation of inflation through the Phillips curve, and the use of monetary and fiscal policy for stabilization. So that's the kind of progression that will occur at the beginning of the course. What we've got as well, and something I'd really like everyone to have a go at, so you can use this QR code or just bash into your phone or tablet this tiny core, so tinyco.re inflation tool. And I hope I can just quickly show you this, what you'll see. Yeah. So what you should see, so remember it's just tiny core, so co.re/inflation tool. And if you have a green and yellow circle going meow, 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 then you're in the right place. Okay, Stephen? Yes, you haven't quite got there yet. Yeah, okay. So anyway, this is kind of putting into practice that sequence that we're going to set out in volume 2. So you can see here that what we're starting with, and this is inflation data for Europe. We're in this new world, and anyone who's done a word cloud this academic year, then inflation, steps out and hits you in the face, and we need to be able to meet that challenge with the modeling that we provide students with. So I'm just going to show you, this is set up as a supply shock, and what happens. So those of you who've been teaching the macro part, you'll recognize this immediately. You have a supply shock like an oil shock, and you get inflation rising every period if there's no policy response. And then just to illustrate what the students can do is, if we just reset this. All right, so here we're asking the student to be the central banker. So if you've got a very kind of dovish mindset, then you might at that stage just increase the interest rate to 2%, and you see what happens. Okay, inflation's still getting higher, unemployment's getting worse too, but there's a slight sense that inflation isn't rising as fast. And then you think, well, that was fairly dull. Let's be very extreme and extremely hawkish and see what happens. Okay, if we whack the interest rate up straight up to 7%, we can get inflation down to target immediately, but at the cost of a really substantial drop in GDP and a rise in unemployment to something like 10%. And Matteo wanted to know what would happen if we chose 4%, right? Or since we can only choose integers here, right? What the Bank of England thinks they're doing. I can just this thing, yeah, 4, right? Okay, ready? Yes, you've stabilized inflation. That was the point. Okay, so this tool goes on. You can test yourself. You can look at different reactions by the central bank. There are the usual MCQs and so on. So I'm not going to spend more time on this, but just to give you an idea of something that we've built. In fact, sorry. Set the nominal interest rate to be negative. No, that yeah, no, they were all nominal interest rates. Yeah, so yeah, no, on the right hand side was the real interest rate, but what you were choosing was always the central banker's choice variable, so the nominal interest rate. So you can, all of those exercises are possible to back out. In fact, the next step was to figure out from the data the coefficient on the Phillips curve and so on. So there's quite a lot that can happen that you can do based on this. And yes, so we will follow up afterwards. People who've been teaching macro this term, please give us some feedback, and we'll improve this and get this out there so that you can incorporate it in your teaching going forward. Okay, so in a sense that sets up the student with a working macro model after 4 weeks, and that was the idea, and it required stripping out quite a bit of the sort of subtlety that doing it in a different order had produced. In particular, having unit 10, you can see unit 10 here, so it went 9, 10, even before you got to the end of sort of 10 units of the economy. You had all of that heavy lifting of balance sheets and a lot of new terms. And we're hoping that doing it this way prepares students, gives them a lot of motivation already coming out of the first 4 units. And then they're then ready to be introduced to the fact, for example, that as Stephen was suggesting, there are circumstances in which you can't use the nominal interest rate as your stabilization tool, and to understand the use of QE and what came with QE, then you need to understand about balance sheets. And we can, by this stage, link the household balance sheet, the firm's balance sheet, the bank's balance sheet, and the central bank's balance sheet. So I think it's a more satisfying progression. One of the big challenges we were confronted with in doing the rewrite was to try to get into the students' minds, and this would be very nice to get your feedback, that many problems in economics are very usefully conceived of as a problem of a smooth surface representing a trade-off, and then the choice taking place and finding a unique, stable equilibrium. And that's like a really powerful model of constrained optimization we use again and again and again. But that somehow they should also exit their introductory economics by having in mind situations where there are multiple equilibria and there are unstable equilibria. And so the challenge really was, how could we construct a pedagogically effective teaching unit that introduced this question of instability? And of course, now again, the crises sort of turn up on a regular enough basis that those of us teaching, so many people here I can see would have been teaching in the classroom in the last few weeks, and we get a banking crisis kind of arriving just on cue to teach. And that, that's clearly an example of a process that is not well modeled by constrained optimization. So this was the idea of having a unit on systemic instability, and as you'll see, I'll just talk a little bit about it in a moment. But before doing that, just to preview the rest, we have a chunk on growth, and we pull together work on growth and structural change in a way that we didn't do before. And again, this was in response to a lot of criticism. Some of our harshest critics are here, which is very rewarding to see them. So we will have a unit on growth, technology, and structural change. So that will be really focused on capital accumulation of various kinds and of diminishing returns, what can offset that, the role of technology, etc. So it will be possible there, if you want to teach solo. It will be presented as an extension, but we will also teach the Lewis model, as Sam suggested. So we'll have a simple two sector view of the world, which we can do as a modification of the WSPS model. So that will be 2.7, and then the more dynamic view of growth, endogenous growth, as is now in Unit 16, will follow. And then the sort of historical chapter, the revision chapter, previously Unit 17. So I'm not going to talk more about that. I want to move on to the systemic instability unit and just give a bit of a feel for how we're thinking of teaching this. So I'm just going to, this is the, gives you an idea of the contents, what will be in the unit, and I'll talk a little bit about stable and unstable equilibria in the housing market. So this is where we're going to be beginning to get students to differentiate between a process, a negative feedback process that produces a stable equilibrium, a negative feedback dynamic process. And remember, by now, they've seen a 45-degree diagram. So what's the 45-degree diagram they've already worked with that has a stable Keynesian cross? Exactly. Okay, so we are going to make use of the fact that they've got those ideas already, and we're now setting up a model to have price this period, price next period on the axes with a 45-degree line. And then when you've got that flatter than 45-degree line that they're familiar with, you will get a convergent process back to equilibrium. That's contrasted with a positive feedback and an unstable equilibrium. So the idea that when house prices rise, if people believe they're going to rise further, then that actually shifts the demand curve up. and the price can rise further, reinforcing the movement away from equilibrium. So that's the sort of building blocks. Those of you who've been teaching TE 1.0 will say, oh yes, seen this before, because this appeared in Unit 11 before. So the reorganization is kind of salvaging pieces of teaching material, so it's not all new, but we've, I think, reorganized it in response to feedback to try to make the kind of chunks fit together more logically. Remember that they've now also just learned about balance sheets, and we can therefore talk about collateral and the financial accelerator process that will that can reinforce the positive feedback process on the way up and on the way down. So now you can just think about it. Okay, you've got a process, a negative feedback process and a stable equilibrium, and you've got the possibility of a positive feedback process and an unstable equilibrium. And remember that image. What was the picture that I had at the very beginning, the photograph at the beginning of this unit? There was a bird involved. Okay, was it right? A swan, yeah. The black swan, yeah, okay. But what is the shape of the swan's neck? Okay, there you go. Right? So this is the S-shaped diagram. That's the visualization. I'm taking the cue from you that, you know, trying to kind of key into to visual images may be helpful in presenting this. So here you've got the image here of the unstable equilibrium. It appears there as A, and we've got the two with the flatter lines, the two stable equilibria at low and high prices. So this is what we call the price dynamic curve. This is the S-shaped version of it. And we see what happens. So when we're up there at the high price, and we can think about how beliefs can change about the fact that this high price is just not sustainable in a forward-looking fashion. So we would think that the S-shaped curve can shift down, and we will eventually hit a tipping point, so that in fact the last tipping point disappears, and then we move on a very rapid process down to a low equilibrium. So that's one way of representing the a dynamic process of a crash in a housing market. We wanted to make use of the fact that we're, you know, developing these ideas of positive feedback processes, positive and negative feedback processes. So we use the physical process that are evident from climate science. So this is the Arctic summer ice in 1979, and you can see there's much less of it. Okay, it hasn't completely gone, but there's clearly a problem of the ice shrinking, and that in the climate science literature is represented by a feedback process of the kind that I've talked about. Okay, so that if with lower temperatures you get extensive summer sea ice, and then the solar radiation is reflected rather than absorbed, and that reinforces that equilibrium. And this is the case at when you're at the low equilibrium. So how do we get there? We have exactly the same S-shaped process, and where the height of this environmental dynamics curve is determined by average temperatures, so that warming shifts that curve down. We eventually get past a tipping point, and we move to this catastrophic situation of without summer sea ice. Okay, so that's the black swan, and something we took very seriously, and we spent a long time trying to think of how to deal with this, is how can we use the tools that we're developing to do things that are not just sort of catastrophes of one form or another, or crises of one form or another. So what we've been working on is to try to use exactly the same set of concepts to talk about averting environmental collapse. And Sam's going to come back and go through that example. Yeah, hi Sam. Just
Okay.
wait a second. We've got to get your screen sharing.
Okay. Tell me when you've got it.
Yeah, it just requires a little manual intervention, and then it'll happen. So this is the last switch. Yeah. Huh. Okay, Sam.
Okay. Okay.
Can you see this? Can you see what we can see? We can see the blue picture.
Great. Perfect. Well, to end this on a happier note, we wanted to talk about a case in which a very similar positive feedback dynamic could actually lead to good things. The students will already have in Unit 1 of Volume 1 heard about technology changing, for example, the very dramatic fall in the price of photovoltaic cells. So we do include at the very beginning of the course both the problem of climate change and rising temperature, and also a bit about there may be possible changes in technology which could be part of the solution. So here we're going to talk about electric vehicles, and the idea is to take a model that the one that Wendy just taught, and then say, oh, look, it can be applied to other things, which is exactly what Ting said in her comment she liked about the idea of learning how to do economics. The graph at the top is just a cost curve for the electric vehicles, a downward sloping cost curve. It's downward sloping because the cost of operating an electric car depends on how many other people also have electric cars, how many charging stations there are, people who understand how they work and repair them, and so on. So also learning by doing in the production of the cars. The flat line is the cost of operating an internal combustion engine car. The horizontal axis is the unit interval, the fraction of all vehicles which are electric. And so you can see at very low usage, electric cars are expensive. At high levels of usage, they're relatively inexpensive. And the we represent the internal combustion engines as independent of the number of people using them, because there already is a very large number using them, and the kinds of phenomena giving the downward sloping curve to the electric vehicles don't really apply to the internal combustion engines. Now, we want to take the graph at the top on the right there and convert it to what Wendy calls the swan's neck graph. Now, suppose we're at point A. We have it at the bottom. We have very few people operating electric vehicles, and we have a stable equilibrium. If for some reason we get a few more, we'll return to point A. Now, the S-shaped curve is based on two things: the cost in the top panel, and some distribution of preferences in the population. It could be a uniform distribution, it could be normal, but it's just some people, for example, are, I'll go for green, I don't care how much it costs, and there are going to be some people who are going to want to have a carbon burning car, even if the electric ones are cheaper. And that's how we get the S-shaped curve. Now, obviously, both point A with very few electric cars and point C with predominantly electric cars are stable equilibria, given the construction that we have here. And B is a tipping point, as in Wendy's graphs. And the problem is, suppose we're at point A, which is roughly where we are now. How do we get to point C? Well, that's a public policy question. It's also a question about people's preferences. In the upper graph on the right there, the dashed line is the effect in lowering costs of various policies that might be adopted. For example, subsidies for the production of electric cars, competition policies to make sure that the markup in the sales and marketing of electric cars is not too high, and so on. Now, that translates into an upward shift in the S-shaped curve in the graph at the below. That could also take place not just through a change in costs, but also through interventions which change people's preferences, how green they are, how interested they are in having a non-polluting car. Now, obviously, the first effect of an upward shift in the S curve in the bottom is to shift the equilibrium from point A to A prime. That is a marginal shift in the S curve gives you a marginal increase in the quantity of electric vehicles. But just as Wendy showed with the house price case, if you shift up far enough, you will simply eliminate the lower equilibrium and move to the higher equilibrium. Now, let's think about this. People say, oh no, wait a minute. Are you going to really teach differential equations to students? I mean, are you insane? No, we're not at all insane. Think about what we're doing here. We're drawing, students have intuitions about what in physics and math is called a phase transition. Water looks like water, then all of a sudden it's something else, it freezes. If you hold a flame near a piece of paper, nothing happens, and then it bursts into flame. You have a friendship, and suddenly the friendship goes wrong somehow, and it can't be restored. All of these kind of irreversible changes are things students know about, think about, and so on. If you think about it, think how complicated a supply and demand graph is compared to that. This is basically two simultaneous equations, and we don't even have a mechanism by which we're supposed to get to the equilibrium. That's not really part of the story. So we think that having a story about a dynamical system in which we actually say, oh, if you're here in the graph, you can see why you would go in this direction or that direction. We think it actually gives us something which students can learn. It also gives them a way of analyzing policy. I mean, you can think of there are lots and lots of exercises you could then do with this kind of graph. We are now extremely happy. Kenneth, I so wish I could be there to say hello to you in person, but we're very much looking forward to your commenting on the slides that Wendy and I have just presented. So the floor is now over to you. I'll stop sharing, and I look forward to seeing you on the screen, if not in person, Kenneth.
Great. Okay. Kenneth, go for it. Actually, maybe I should introduce you.
Oh, right, so maybe.
Okay, so okay, you can. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So while the tech's happening, yeah, get the slides up. Thank you. Just let me give a very warm welcome to Kenneth Creamer, who's come from Johannesburg yesterday to be part of the workshop. It's another slide set. Yes. So, Kenneth has been part of the core project for many years. We had a fantastic workshop at WITS in 2018, and he's an advisor to the Central Bank of the Reserve Bank of South Africa, and a macroeconomist. So who better to give us some critical inputs than Kenneth? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. And Sam, I hope you can hear me. Hi, Sam.
Yes, I can hear you, Kenneth. Great. Great to see you. You're looking fantastic.
Thank you, Sam. I hope you're feeling well. So I've put on, can you see the slides, Sam? No, not on what's happening on the screen. It's a picture of you and Wendy at my university about 2017, so about 6 years ago. So a very similar workshop to this one. And following, Sam and Wendy actually came twice in a short period. And following that, we introduced the core textbook at our university in Johannesburg, as well as at the University of Cape Town, and to a smaller extent at some of the other universities. So I haven't looked for a while, but when you look at the user statistics of core website, where are people coming from? A good chunk of them are coming from our country, from my country, South Africa, which makes me very happy. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I would just like to respond to some of the points raised. As we all know, Core is a really big book, and we can't talk about everything, but some of the points that were just raised by Sam and Wendy and the students as well, just to reflect on how we're approaching those. I think there's just 4 points. The one is a more holistic and balanced narrative around the hockey stick, my reflections on that. And I must say that I spend a few minutes every year telling my students about what a hockey stick is, because in our country, a hockey stick doesn't look like your hockey stick. It's actually should be called an ice hockey stick. And I'd like you to correct that in the next edition. Yeah, it's not a hockey stick, it's an ice hockey stick. A hockey stick goes backwards in time. But that's not really my main point. And then deepening the understanding of systemic risks. I really think it's so important. I could see Wendy's eyes lighting up when she started talking about this. It's really a big leap, I think, to get our students to understand systemic risk, and let's be bold and let's talk about that, having the tools and methods to do that, both in the application to the financial markets and also in the environmental setting. I think it's really good, and we must do that. And then lastly, just a brief comment on the dual economy application that we heard about. So just 4 points I want to make. I think I've got until about 20 minutes in the program, so I'll talk very slowly. The hockey stick, as we know, in the land of Malthus, the Malthusian trap was escaped after many centuries and maybe millennia of the flat part of the hockey stick, and then there was this upsurge in the GDP per capita as the world escaped that trap, albeit at different times, in different regions and different places, different rates. That's really the story that we tell. And I really like the way the students said, you know, it's kind of the way we're explaining it, it's not sufficient, you know, that it's almost like, well, that was a necessary process, or not understanding the linkage between the fact that the one went up and the other one didn't go up, and those linkages are not properly elaborated. And I think it's very important to be more explicit about the realities of colonialism, slavery, as has been mentioned, and also the carbon. So it's the two C's, the carbon and the colonialism. We have at my university have core 1.5. I don't know if any of you have got that, which is the interim edition, where into our slides we slip in other ideas to correct for some of the weaknesses. So we'll show our students a diagram like that, which is probably very familiar to you, which says that we don't talk about the Indian experience, but we could. But in South Africa, we talk about the Atlantic slave trade, which was a powerful contributing factor for the shaping of the Industrial Revolution. Try to integrate it from the first lecture, first few weeks. Enslaved people taken from Africa to the Americas along the Southern Passage, you can see there, to work in the production of the raw materials, and then cheap raw materials taken to Europe from the Americas along the Northern Passage, stimulating economic growth and cheap access to sugar and all these good things that held the prices down and made Europe competitive in its, and sent price signals and relative price changes into the Industrial Revolution. And then the manufactured goods taken to Africa to trade for the enslaved people. And that I think students start to realize that there's historical reasons, there's historical relationships that have meant that it's not just that the hockey stick happened to happen in some places first and then later, or not at all. in other places, but we need to really get into that. I don't know if the new textbook should talk about reparations and bringing economic tools into the study of the reparations debate. I think it's something that is an obvious question once you understand the historical processes. It's just something to put out there. Then the carbon side, the linkages between increased carbon dioxide output, rising global temperatures, economic impact on climate change, I think all should be strengthened and correctly. I'm excited, really excited to get that into my hands and start to teach that to students. I'm sitting here thinking it's going to be good. It's going to be good to refresh our approach with this new edition that is coming out. One of the thoughts that came into my mind is, what about the degrowth arguments? I'm not sure if the degrowth arguments are being dealt with in the textbook. I haven't read it yet. You're nodding. Because obviously that would be one natural, maybe not a well economically informed response, but a natural response to the carbon damage of the hockey stick would be, well, growth is bad. You know, the syllogism would be, if economic growth has caused environmental degradation, and environmental degradation is bad for the people of our planet, then to save the people of our planet, our policy should be to limit economic growth. I'm sure my students, some of them are very bright. They will say, well, that's why are you arguing for growth? Because growth is damaging the world. I think we must be equipped to deal with those counter arguments around the degrowth ideas. They're too simplistic. And as economists, I know none of you think like this, but it'd be good to formally deal with it. Could discuss the role of technology in shaping growth. Some of those points are already hinted at, even in the current edition. There's, I don't know if this is a controversial thing, I haven't really researched it, but the environmental Kuznets curve is quite a useful technique where it shows that as the economy grows, environmental degradation initially increases and then begins to fall. You know, and maybe it's too simplistic, but it's a useful heuristic or device to teach students. You can just show them a curve where things get worse and then get better. Might be one of the ways to look at it. And then also just to talk about the nature of economic growth. It's not just about more of X plus Y plus Z, but the types and quality of products changes. So it's more growth is X plus A plus B. You know, things change within that. And it's that changing composition and quality of growth that impacts on the degree of environmental degradation. Because is it the growth, the tipping point towards low carbon vehicles, towards renewable energy, then it has very different consequences for the planet and for the carbon output. So growth then, if growth changes its qualities, then it can't be seen as bad inherently in terms of that. So that's just an idea that I think we could think about. Then turning to my, is it my second point? Yeah, I think the second point, systemic risk. So idiosyncratic risk and systematic risk are regarded as inherent and endogenous to the market, and action must be taken to manage such risks. Systemic risk appears, just my argument, I might be wrong, but it appears to be exogenous. As the system seems to be working okay, and the feedback mechanisms reinforce the overall direction of the system until the black swan appears. And then the assumptions break down, behaviors change that were based on those incorrect assumptions, and feedback mechanisms begin to work in reverse. There's just an idea of how these things fit together. So the bursting of the housing price bubble that Wendy spoke about in 2008 and the resulting crisis for the banking and financial system, everything was really going well, 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 crash. And when the black swan landed. Paradox being that systemic shocks seem to be impossible before they happen and inevitable after they occur in the system. It's a systemic problem. Some of my thoughts on that. So idiosyncratic risk, we know about portfolio diversification because some assets are at risk. Systematic risk, really just about widening the assets potentially as a solution because many of the assets are at risk. But systemic risk, the system as a whole is at risk. And this requires an analysis of the properties of the system as a whole and requires policy instruments to identify risks to the system as a whole. I think Sam and Wendy are talking about marginal analysis, and we're moving beyond that kind of marginal analysis to say, well, the systemic risk is the system as a whole and cannot be identified by those tools correctly. So I think it's an important thing for our students to understand, and because it does crop up from time to time. You know, we're seeing it as there's a crisis. There's almost like a flock of black swans on the horizon that keep popping up. You know, it's not like it's that unusual. There's always some kind of systemic crisis that is showing itself for the system as a whole. And then the question is, do we have the tools to detect some of that systemic risk? So, as I've said, the pre-2008 crisis assumption of ever-rising housing prices led to reinforcing feedback mechanisms. As prices rise, the demand for housing prices, driven by the speculators, the size of collateral rises, housing price demand goes up, prices rise further. When the bubble bursts, the bank balance sheets are damaged and assets are rapidly repriced. And from experience, the intuition of this reinforcing feedback mechanism from, I think it's unit 10, I think we deal with balance sheets, and bursting price bubbles is quite easy to teach. And I think it's intuitive and easy to explain. But I do suspect that as we transition now to this, the beautiful neck of the swan and the S-shaped curves, we're going to have to put a lot of teaching time into that. It's for me less intuitive. Maybe I haven't taught it as much, but it's a question of how do we explain the shape of that curve? What causes the shape where there's the tipping point in the middle and there's these two stable points? Really, do you understand why the shape? And then once you've got the shape, do you understand the movements? Like precisely, why does it happen that if many people think the pricing of housing is a bubble and it's too high, does this move downwards? Or if many people think that we should move, no, the government encourages us to buy electric vehicles and subsidizes us, it starts to shift upwards, as Sam says, those preferences. Because once you understand the shape, and there's 2 points of stability and the unstable equilibrium, and what a tipping point really is, and then there's the movement. But I think just advice to myself and to any of you, we're going to have to teach that pretty thoroughly, because there's a lot to be learned from that. But you're looking at it, it starts to mesmerize you a little bit until you really grasp it. But so what I'm getting in my summary on this point is systemic risk. I think it's good. It's a good tool of analysis. Our students need to start to understand this, but the way we're explaining it requires work. And I think the last point under systemic risk is the policy instruments. I'm not sure. I haven't read the book yet. It's still being written. Are we going to talk about the policy responses to systemic risk? You know, is that going to be a part of what we talk about? Or are we just going to tell students there is such a thing as systemic risk? This is how you identify it, and this is how you draw the graph? Or do we say, well, this is what now needs to be done, and at least highlight some of those? So what could I say? Things like the framing of prudential policy. I mean, we currently do mention prudential policies in the core, which they say aim at avoiding calamitous events, even though the policies are costly and there's uncertainty about whether you need them, you know, because it's just like a prudential, there's a slight possibility of a black swan, or there's not a high possibility. We're not sure, but we need to put resources into preparing for that. I know in other books you've read, Wendy, the financial cycle instrument, just to start to identify, being able to identify when these pressures are building up. Do we introduce some of those concepts? Are we thinking about that to show that the asset prices are rising, stock prices are rising, housing prices are rising, or then because the financial cycle is an instrument to signal when there could possibly be a black swan about to land. There's some kind of risk. Systemic risk is rising. Systemic risk is rising in the system. What are the instruments? Policies are looking at bank balance sheets, instruments to deal with overheating housing market. What are these? What do we need to tell students? What are the instruments if the housing market's getting hot? What do we do? South Africa, at some point, they wouldn't allow us to take 100% bonds anymore from the bank. You know, so that you'd have to put in a 10 or 20% deposit if you wanted to buy a house in order to cool down the housing market. And I'm just putting it out there, like once you've understood systemic risk, once you understand the financial instruments that might be, what are the financial instruments that might be needed? The role of stress testing. I mean, you talk about the Silicon Valley Bank, you know, we all know with reading the news now is that they were recently exempted from the stress testing that would have been put in place because of the notion of systemic risk, understanding that well, what would happen to your bank hypothetically if inflation rose and the Fed continued to increase interest rates for a sustained period? What would happen to your balance sheet? No, we don't need to do that test anymore because our holdings are less than 250 billion. And so these are natural questions for me. You know, I'd love to then tell my students, well, yeah, let's talk. Once you understand systemic risk really nicely and you can draw the graphs, what do you do? What are the implications of that? I don't have much to add on the systemic risk and the climate. I think it's really exquisite and excellent and very exciting. Can't wait to start teaching that. It's really nice to also, you know, obviously we've already applied it in core, the economy 1.0 to the melting polar ice. That we'll continue to do that, but to show the tipping point moving in the other way, where you have this incentive for the move to electric vehicles away from internal combustion engines, and it's just an exciting application, and I think it's really useful. There are also the linkages. I need to get my head around it because the student's going to say, but sir, you already taught us about the industrial revolution and price signals and relative price changes causing technological change. Now you're telling us it's something else. And I'll have to explain, no, I haven't thought about that, but you know, there are linkages where we've explained technological change in different ways, in different parts of the textbook. And we just need to answer those very basic questions. I'm sure we can come up with an answer. Then the last point was this dual economy. I come from the most unequal economy on earth, both in terms of wealth and income distribution measured by the Gini coefficient. And so it's quite useful to have a dual economy model, because when you show the model of technological change currently, it just looks great. You know, you have technological change, and if you allow the change to happen in the solar model, and if you allow the Schumpeterian forces to take place, then everyone's going to be fine. There's going to be jobs, employment for everybody, because that new technology brings new profitable opportunities, and we find a new equilibrium. But it's not, if you look out the window, what's really happening in our society. But the strong dualism in the economy, where there's a stack of long-term unemployed people, 30%, 40% who are dispossessed of the land, or dispossessed of opportunity, education. And the beauty of the elegance of the Lewis model at least allows you to look at the linkages between these two sectors, you know, and say, well, yes, if there's successful technological change in the formal sector, then we can see the impact this has on the formal sector, and also it leads to fewer people and rising productivity, for example, in the informal sector. So the landed mass of people, there'll be fewer people there, there'll be higher productivity potentially, and there'll be benefits from the upgrade in the formal sector. There'll be some flow through to the informal sector. Similarly, the other way around, if we can improve what's happening in our informal sector in terms of land access, support for nascent farming activity, proper services, agricultural, rural development, again, the model can potentially show the Lewis model shows you that land reform and improved rural services directly raises productivity and income in the formal sector, but it also raises the level of the fallback option for the workers employed in the formal sector, putting potentially upward pressure on formal sector wages. So it's just a good integration for me, again, for our circumstances, because we're always having to qualify what we say. So, well, look, this doesn't really apply here, but this is how it works in theory. But now we can say, well, look, this is how it links with some of the dual nature of our economy. I think there's more to this from what Sam and Wendy just said, but this is how I interpreted how I would use it. Because I spoke about the gig economy and global and other things, but this is hopefully what is being meant. And then from me, the final word, as a teacher who uses core in teaching economics students, I'm very excited. As I said, it's a fundamentally healthy process that we continuously try to improve the way we teach, thinking deeply about the models, the data, the examples, the historic analysis, the way we say things, as the student said, the way we articulate. It's really, really healthy. I don't know, I've never been in an experience like that where we get direct thinking about, do you really mean to say it like this? Or should you rather say it like that? It's a very healthy process, and thank you for that. And this will help us to improve the impact of our teaching, and will strengthen the ways that students engage with us and find uses for the economic concepts that we teach. So that's all. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kenneth. That was really, really helpful. Can we get Sam back up on the screen? That would be great. Yeah, okay, there you are. Very good, maybe a bit bigger. It's gonna work, yes. Yes, very good, okay. So I think we've had a lot of, we've talked a lot, we've had a lot of feedback from Kenneth, but before we close this session, I think what would be really great is to have some comments, suggestions from the floor, and more grist to the mill to try to make this better. So let me invite anyone who would like to make a contribution. Carlin. So I think it's good if everyone introduces themselves.
Thank you very much.
Say, Carolina, could you use the mic? I can't quite hear you, Carolina.
Yeah. So if you come up and we've got a roving mic even. Fantastic.
Okay, let me try.
Yeah, we can hear you. Sam, can you hear now?
Can you hear
Yeah.
Sam?
Yeah.
Great.
Hi, Carolina.
Hello, Sam. How are you?
I'm good.
Good. So yeah, 3 points. One is regarding this unpleasant side of capitalism, which is just great. Well done. And I like the capitalism carbon colony precept. Yeah, it's very interesting. I have two comments here. One is regarding, and I think Kenneth and the students also highlight that, to try to show this that the rise of the West, the British Revolution, the development of capitalism is happening at the same time that there is the decline of other civilizations around the globe. And we mentioned India a lot here, and I saw on the slides as well, but there are, for example, Jairus Banachi has a book called A Brief History of Commercial Capitalism that shows how many civilizations out of Europe were so developed, commercially developed, at the time that England was having an industrial revolution. And I think it's important to highlight that. There's another book called How the West Came to Rule. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this, and perhaps that takes me to my second comment, is why capitalism, carbon, and colony were not made with imperialism. Because that will take our discussion to imperialism. And it's quite important. I would like my students to leave that model knowing about the role of British Revolution, but also the role of the British Empire. And I think imperialism could make that link. The other point is regarding structural transformation in artificial yields. I think this is also very interesting. But I wonder, I have a criticism. Well, this criticism is not towards you, which is the question of the emphasis on industrialization, and I wonder how we are approaching this, and perhaps this is also related to Kenneth's comment regarding the limits of growth, the degrowth, because this model is really this dualistic economy, agriculture, and how we move to industrial economy, which is related to productivity and so on. I think this is something we have to start looking more carefully, and I wonder how we are dealing with this, especially because that take us to think about the international trade, the role of different countries in that, and the possibility of certain countries to actually develop and become industrial in a way we actually sometimes we are teaching our students in a kind of a linear version of progress. So I think in that perhaps taking me to the other point that has been mentioned here, which is also, can we really look now thinking about the green transition and look at these global South countries as not just providing the raw material you need for batteries and lithium, all these discussions we're having now. And I think this is important because perhaps we just play this role of not being able to industrialize, whatever that means currently, because of the position they have
in this global economy, which is also another criticism toward Lewis, the neglect of international trade and so on. And my last comment, and perhaps I'm biased here, is regarding Latin America when it comes to the Caribbean labor, why Latin America was excluded there. That's how I saw it. Perhaps it's not, because as we know, during the Atlantic slave trade, Brazil imported the more enslaved African than any other countries, and the sugar economy was a big deal for Brazil and for Brazil in the international economy. So I just was wondering why that didn't feature there. Yeah, that's all. Sorry, too long, but yeah.
Thank you, Carolina. Sam, do you want to respond? And then we can have one more.
I think it'd be best if we had more from the floor. We're kind of out of time. I mean, I'd love to respond, but I've already been talking too much, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we should use up the rest of our time on collecting comments rather than addressing them.
Hi, is this on?
Yep.
Yes. Great. Joe Michelle, University of the West of England. Thank you very much, everybody, for the contributions so far. I'll try and keep it short. One comment on the kind of hockey stick stories. And I detect a kind of tension between trying to tell a finished narrative of this is what happened versus presenting open questions and debate about different interpretations. And in Core 1.0, I sort of read it as presenting the Bob Allen story of industrialization, cost of wages versus cost of coal. But that's still an open debate. There are people who say Bob Allen's got it all wrong, and there are other theories of that period. And the tension came out interestingly in the comments about India. That was sort of presented as a question, and I think you've probably both said, actually, we're going to change that to a statement. So how do we deal with these kind of issues of open debate in our subject, unfinished sort of questions? Should we present them to students as, here is final science, the story, or should we sort of present them as open debates? And in a sense, I sort of felt like both of those were examples where the emphasis could shift a bit. I don't know how you've dealt with the kind of the Bob Allen story in relation to the carbon colonies and so on. I'd be interested to hear on that. On systemic instability, I think you've got to be very careful about presenting climate change as a black swan. It's not a black swan, but as you show very clearly, carbon is there in the history of capitalism from the beginning. And so I think presenting that as in the framing of a swan, we need to be very careful about. I'm in two minds about this swan diagram. I like it. I like the idea of presenting non-linearities and so on. But a lot of these things, the tipping point is not, it's not like you move to a new equilibrium. It's a continuous process of disequilibrium dynamics. The top of credit bubbles are usually things like banks hitting limits, banks failing, interest rates rising, inflation rising, triggering an interest rate. They're a big mess. So I'm thinking perhaps things like predator-prey models, where you have continuous dynamics and interacting variables. If you're going to go to dynamic systems and say, well, look, students can handle this, I mean, you can animate them and so on. What about showing disequilibrium dynamic systems rather than multiple equilibria equilibrium systems? That's it.
Great suggestion.
Hi, Vivek Prasad from St. Andrews. So just a bit of background information to frame I have 4 questions, which I just want to give out there. So at St. Andrews, we have a unique system. Our degrees are 4 years, and I teach first year. And our first years students can choose an econ module without having an intention of studying any more econ. And they also, we don't have any prerequisites on these modules, so they can have no prior econ background. Additionally, I teach macro in semester 2. It used to be in semester 1. The point I'm making here is that students do not need to do micro before they do macro. So our macro module is a standalone module, and my module has around 500 students. So my questions, so I sort of have a unique challenge in using core because it presents, because of the linkages with the macro units to the micro units. I have to be very careful with my macro colleague covering these units? And if I don't have prerequisites, how do I insist to students that they must have this prior knowledge? Now that opens up my first question. My first question, I noticed that the 2.2 of macro begins with the wage setting, price setting model. And that, of course, builds on the labor discipline model, which micro covers. So it doesn't seem like the macro textbook is going to be a standalone textbook. It seems like it has to be that one has to cover the micro textbook and specifically cover that labor discipline model as a prerequisite for using macro 2.2. So I'm wondering if you have any comment on that, because that is particularly challenging for me. A related problem is my students have great difficulty with the wage setting, price setting model and the labor discipline model. And because it occupies a big chunk of the module, 50% of it, and we use that model to explain all of policy, if they don't get it, they fail the module. And this is it's sort of a, it's not satisfying for students because they understand various little pieces of the module. And yet when we come to this very big chunk, and if they don't get that module, that model, they really, really struggle. So now I notice that you're putting that up front and you're sticking to the same system of using that model to explain monetary policy, etc. So I'm just worried about my students in the future. Another point is so teaching economy 1.0. I feel like I'm teaching a small closed economy, and I wonder if we'll internationalize the models a bit. I often get questions from students when we do monetary policy. It does feel like we're doing closed economy until I get to the point of using the exchange rate transmission mechanism. And students are very interested in understanding, okay, so we're in Britain and we have this very open economy. How does this apply? So it doesn't seem like the economy is going to be opened up in the 2.2. So I'm wondering if that's something that's going to be addressed. And my last question is, so I noticed that you're putting the banking chapter after monetary policy. So the banking chapter, I teach the banking chapter before monetary policy. And that's because it helps to explain how the central bank's base rate gets transmitted to lending rates. So I'm wondering how you're going to address that if it's not there. And maybe as a footnote to that question, would it be worthwhile explaining in the 2.2 a bit more about how the base rate gets transmitted into interest rates across the economy changing in tandem? Because my students sometimes, they don't get it. And I don't think the textbook is quite clear. It just assumes it moves because of a fixed markup.
Wendy, I think it would be good if you could respond very briefly to these last questions. They're somewhat factual responses you can give, which I think people would like answers to.
Yeah, okay. So the idea is that it will be possible to teach the macro without the micro. It will be a kind of reduced form version of the wage setting and price setting model. For example, Blanchard very blithely teaches the wage setting, price setting model with no prerequisites. So anything he can do, we can do better. So I don't think that's a problem. The wage setting, price setting model is challenging. I think we are getting better at teaching it, and this is a crowdsourcing issue of trying to get even more help. I think we are helped by the motivation at the moment. Everyone is suddenly very exercised by inflation and wage price spirals in a way they haven't cared about for years. And this model gives you that. So I think, which other models don't. And so I think it's very, in that sense, there's a big payoff if students can invest in the model. International, okay, there is a limit to what, you've got curious students, I've got curious students, but at a certain point, you cannot do everything. If you're going to do things well enough that they're able to manage a small closed economy model very confidently after 4 weeks, then I think you've achieved a hell of a lot. And for the ones that want to be pointed in the right direction, to understand open economy, where you have to understand flexible exchange rates, fixed exchange rates, you know, that is a whole nother chunk, which many students don't even get in their second year macro. So, you know, we have to be a little bit careful about not promising too much. The banking chapter, I think there are always trade-offs about doing this, but I think there is a big gain from the students having a model they can use themselves, a full model with the private sector and the policymaker before they have the complication of the banks. And so I think it's not too big a stretch to just use an interest rate when they're just learning, you know, as that tool I was showing you, just how that feeds through the economy. So I think personally the pedagogical gains are worth it, and then do the banks, bring in the banks, because that's another conceptual challenge, I think, for students to master the idea of private money and to understand the balance sheet relationships. Again, once they get that, they're then very empowered to do the next chunk. So yeah, so that would be a brief response there. But you know, your help, I think, is also being asked for. Yeah. Okay, great. Stephen. We're stealing. I feel very guilty.
I'll be very quick.
Right.
Firstly, just supporting this point about just because we're asking questions, really important questions, doesn't mean we need to give definitive answers.
Completely.
I think the point about colonialism and growth, you know, we don't have to give them clear-cut answers on this, and I don't think there are clear-cut answers, and there's lots of things, and we have to say up front, you know, we ask questions, but we don't give clear-cut answers, and there's always the temptation to try and give them clear-cut answers, but some questions just I'm still not clear that we can answer the question on colonialism and development. The other point, I'm still the S diagram. I'm not sure whether it should be associated with black swans, because a lot of it isn't really about. A lot of it is, you know, it's going back so far. But I think if we can do, you know, actually linking unit 1 of the so-called micro module book and the end and the climate change stuff in the macro book, you know, the temptation is that there must be an S-shaped diagram that says it looks at the moment as if we're on the benign bit of the S diagram. Global economy has been growing really remarkably well for the last 33 decades. Is it all going to go horribly wrong? Because, you know, a lot of our students have just assumed that Extinction Rebellion is right, and we're going to go. It's all going to be. We're going to be sliding down the swan's neck. Except it isn't a swan's neck, because it isn't actually a black swan. It looks like a swan's neck. So be careful with those metaphors. And then just a little slightly sly observation. I don't like the split between micro and macro, but that's all right, because there's loads of macro in the micro book.
Exactly. Thank you, Stephen. You're our advertising agent. Great. Okay, so this is kind of like crowdsourcing coffee time or break time. Is everyone happy to eat their coffee break or whatever the word is, and allow a few more questions?
Great, thank
Christian.
you. Yeah, Christian Spielman from Bristol. Yeah, it's great to see how the environment is elevated even more than in the first part of core. Been trying to get more about the environment into my teaching in the first year for several years now. I think it's something students really want to think about and want to know more about. I mean, one question for me is like factual, what happens to the capstone units, and does the environment still exist somewhere? Or is everything integrated?
Should I just answer that quickly, because it also relates to your question? Okay, so people are asking this question about the capstones. Some chunks have been taken from the capstones to bring more environment actually into the units, for example, but the capstones will be floated off as independent core insights.
Yeah,
and that will deal also a bit with the globalization questions that several people have raised, because the unit on globalization will be available as a self-standing core insight. So if you haven't used the core insights, go and look at them. They're really useful teaching tools all, self-contained with links to the relevant sections of the other ebooks. So there will be an environment for insight based on the capstone.
Great. And I guess by getting the environment more into the main text, I think Core 1.0 has done it really successfully with inequality. But even there, we are now saying like, oh, we haven't treated some of the aspects correctly, and we have to think about our phrasing. There is literature out there where we have to be more nuanced. And I guess it's almost maybe a bit of a warning by getting the environment into the main textbook. There are also so many nuances. So when we talk about electric cars, for example, there's a whole literature around, well, it very much depends on how your energy is produced, and they're comparing different parts of the world. So we have to kind of make sure that we are not open to attack by being not clear enough. There's a huge discussion about what do we actually mean by sustainability. So the economic idea about sustainability is a different one to maybe in the wider public. So do we identify clearly what sustainability is? I think Kuznets curve could work quite well, but on the other hand, that I think it only works if we refer to the empirical literature, because the estimates are very different. CO2 doesn't really show a Kuznets curve. Other parts have shown or have shown some sort of Kuznets curves. I also think that it's maybe not black swan, even though it's used in the same way in the environmental literature. It's a fat tails, right? Which is talked about. I think that's maybe the way to talk about it. And then finally, I think with the degrowth, we have a real opportunity here, because Core already focuses on inequality, and there is lots of estimates about what kind of growth would the world need to overcome or improve inequality certain levels. So our World in Data has a really good article on that. And I think that's really where the link could happen between the environment and inequality. I could say more, but that's enough.
Yeah. Great.
Can I just mention something very quickly on the degrowth? Because I know everybody's mentioning, and I think it's an important point, but I think it's also a literature that's vast, as many things in economics, and complex. And I wonder perhaps if we should also consider green growth, because then it deals, from my perspective, it deals with consumption and production in a perhaps more, I don't know if detailed or a more interesting way than degrowth. I'm ambivalent. I don't know which one is better, but I think we should consider this.
Okay, I think we could speak about this all day, frankly, and I think we've had enough of people's patience. I think everyone has made very, very useful contributions, but we need to have time to talk to each other. That's the other thing about the core workshop. So we should stop this plenary and get a cup of coffee, and please talk with each other. And we're coming back. If I can look at the session 3, 12:15. Okay, that's okay. We've got 10 minutes. So 10 minutes for a coffee, a chat, talk to someone new that you don't know, and we'll be back here to talk about the labor market. Thanks.